December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor burns. Every Allied commander scrambles to answer the same question: how do you stop Japan? They studied the fleet, they studied the aircraft, they studied the infantry tactics. Nobody studied the one man who would terrify Allied soldiers more than any of it. One rifle, no flash, no smoke, no trace. And by the time anyone understood what they were dealing with, the officers were already dead. Japan spent 10 years building him. 10 years selecting the best marksmen from entire provinces. 10 years teaching him to sit motionless in a hole for 3 days without food, without water, without making a sound. 10 years engineering a rifle that fired without flash, without smoke, without a single visual trace. By 1942, he was the most dangerous individual soldier on any battlefield in the world. And nobody, not the British, not the Australians, not the Americans, had any answer for him. This is not the story of the Marines who fought him. This is the story of how Japan created him, what he was designed to do, why he was almost impossible to stop, and how, slowly, expensively, one dead Marine at a time, the answer was finally found. Most armies select snipers by accident. A soldier shoots well on the range. An officer notices. The soldier gets a better rifle and a different assignment. That is how most of the world's armies produced their marksmen in the Second World War, by upgrading existing soldiers. Japan did something entirely different. The Imperial Japanese Army ran its sniper selection the way a craftsman selects an apprentice. Instructors observed entire training cohorts over months, not days. They were not looking for the best shooter in the platoon. They were looking for a specific combination of qualities that most military systems never thought to test for together: shooting accuracy, physical endurance, and, above everything else, psychological stillness. The ability to do nothing, completely, for a very long time. Most soldiers, under pressure, need to move. They need to shift position, adjust their grip, scan in a new direction. This is a natural human response to stress. It is also, in a sniper hide, a death sentence, because movement is the one thing a hidden man cannot afford. The men Japan selected had learned to suppress this instinct before they ever picked up a military rifle. Many came from rural backgrounds, hunters and farmers from the Japanese countryside, from Korea, from Manchuria, men who had spent their childhoods in hides, waiting for animals that would flee at the smallest sound or movement. They were not trained to be patient. They already were. What the Imperial Army's sniper schools added was doctrine, marksmanship refinement, and one crucial psychological element: the understanding that their position was permanent. A Japanese sniper did not plan his exit before he planned his shot. He planned his shot, and he accepted that the exit might not come. This was the first thing that made him different from every other sniper on every other battlefield. He was not trying to survive the mission, he was trying to complete it. And that distinction, that fundamental difference in how he understood his own role, made him extraordinarily difficult to dislodge, to intimidate, or to predict. Every army issues its snipers an accurate rifle. Japan issued its snipers an invisible one. The distinction matters more than it might seem. Accuracy determines whether the bullet hits. Invisibility determines whether anyone can find you after it does. And in the terrain where Japan intended to fight, dense jungle, broken island terrain, close distances where muzzle blast echoes between trees, invisibility was worth more than an extra 100 meters of range. The bolt-action rifle Japan developed for its snipers was, by Western technical standards, unremarkable. The optic was low magnification. The cartridge it fired was considered underpowered against the rounds American and British rifles used. Intelligence analysts who evaluated it early in the war concluded it posed no special problem. They were measuring the wrong things. Japanese ordnance engineers had done something no other major military had thought to do systematically. They developed a dedicated reduced propellant ammunition load specifically for use in this rifle. The longer barrel, combined with the lower velocity propellant, produced a muzzle signature that Allied troops and analysts consistently described in the same terms. Almost no flash, almost no smoke. When this rifle fired, there was nothing to see. No orange burst at the muzzle, no gray drift of smoke curling through the undergrowth. The sound of the shot, a sharp crack, gave a direction but no precise point of origin. In jungle terrain, where sound bounces and direction is already difficult to read, even that faint clue is unreliable. Allied after-action reports from every theater where Japanese snipers operated returned to this same problem repeatedly. Troops could not locate the shooter, not because he was especially far away. In jungle terrain, he was often uncomfortably close, but because the rifle he was using had been specifically engineered to leave nothing for them to find. This was not an accident of design, it was the design. Japan had looked at the environment where it intended to fight, identified the single most important tactical advantage a sniper could have in that environment, and built the weapon around that advantage. Western armies had started with accuracy and worked outward. Japan had started with concealment and worked inward. The result was a rifle that was, in its intended context, something Allied forces had never trained to fight against and had no immediate answer for. A sniper with a hidden rifle is dangerous. A sniper with a hidden rifle and a specific set of instructions about who to kill first is something else entirely. Japanese sniper doctrine was not improvised in the field. It was written, distributed, and drilled into every man who went through the sniper training pipeline, and its central principle was one that Allied military planners, when they first encountered evidence of it, found almost clinically chilling. Do not shoot the soldier, shoot the man the soldiers depend on. In practical terms, this meant a priority target list that Japanese snipers were trained to run through every time they selected a target. Officers first, identifiable by insignia, by the way other men oriented toward them, by the map case or the binoculars. Radio operators next, then the corpsmen, the machine gun crew, the artillery spotter. Anyone whose death would not just reduce the enemy's numbers but reduce their ability to function as a unit. A Japanese sniper was not trying to kill as many men as possible. He was trying to collapse the command structure of the unit in front of him with the fewest shots possible. And then the sniper would wait. Not 5 minutes, not an hour, sometimes an entire day, while the platoon below him reorganized, while replacement leaders tried to assert themselves, while the men in the foxhole scanned the tree line and found nothing. The Japanese sniper in his prepared hide remained motionless and silent, waiting for the next priority target to present itself. There was a second element to the doctrine that American veterans described long after the war with a particular kind of discomfort, the let-them-pass tactic. A Japanese sniper would identify a patrol route. He would select and prepare his hide, and when the patrol came, he would let every man pass, sometimes within yards of his position, before opening fire from behind. The patrol's instinct was to face the threat ahead. The threat was now behind them, and by the time they reoriented, the sniper had already shifted position through a prepared connecting trench. It was not just effective militarily, it was psychologically devastating. It meant no trail was safe, no direction was clear, no moment of apparent calm could be trusted. The Japanese sniper's weapon was the rifle. His armor was the earth itself. Standard infantry concealment in most armies meant using available cover, a boulder, a fallen tree, a shell crater. You moved to the cover the terrain provided and you fired from it. This approach was adequate for conventional combat. Against an enemy actively hunting you, it was insufficient. Japanese sniper training devoted enormous attention to what the men themselves called the prepared hide, a position that was not found but built, sometimes days before it would be used. The most basic version was a hole dug into the ground, large enough for a man to lie in, with a narrow opening oriented toward the expected line of fire. The excavated earth was removed and scattered. The opening was framed with vegetation cut from elsewhere and allowed to wilt slightly so it matched the surrounding undergrowth. The interior was lined against noise. A connecting trench, sometimes several feet long, led to a secondary position the sniper could move to silently if the first was compromised. This hide was not a temporary shelter. It was a purpose-built firing position that, when correctly constructed, was essentially undetectable from ground level. The canopy variant was different, a position established high in the jungle trees, sometimes with a man physically secured to the trunk to prevent him from falling if wounded. These positions offered elevated fields of fire across areas that ground-level hides could not reach. They were also, once identified, difficult to suppress without heavy weapons. The psychological effect of these hides on Allied troops was profound and lasting. Veterans of the Pacific Campaign described a specific form of anxiety that developed after sustained exposure to sniper fire, the inability to trust any apparently empty position. A foxhole could be occupied. A fallen tree could conceal a trench entrance. A tree that had been checked yesterday could be occupied today. The environment itself became the enemy's weapon. Japan had turned the jungle, unfamiliar, disorienting, claustrophobic, into an extension of the sniper's concealment. And Allied forces in 1942 had almost nothing to counter it. The first Allied units to encounter Japanese snipers in sustained combat were not prepared for what they found. This was not a failure of courage or competence. It was a failure of imagination, specifically, the failure to imagine an enemy whose methods were so different from European warfare that the standard mental model simply did not apply. In Europe, sniper fire followed certain patterns. The shots came from distance. The targets were often of opportunity. Counterfeber devoted in German Hungarian archery, looking for muzzle flash, uses of movement, evident under covering fire, worked as those snipers operated in ways that were fundamentally similar to Allied doctrine. In the Pacific, nothing transferred. The shots came from close range with no muzzle signature. The targets were not of opportunity. They were selected by priority. The shooter was not on the edge of the enemy's position. He was sometimes behind the Allied line entirely, having let the patrol pass before engaging. And when a unit tried to respond, there was nothing to respond to. The canopy was empty. The undergrowth was still. The sniper was already in his secondary position. British forces operating in Burma and New Guinea were among the first to document the scale of the problem. Forward observers, the men who directed artillery fire, began disappearing to single shots at a rate that disrupted entire operations. The officers most needed to coordinate in advance were the first to die. Patrols that reported a clear tree line in the morning were taking casualties from the same tree line in the afternoon. American forces arriving in the Pacific brought counter-sniper training developed for European conditions. It did not work. The first 18 months of Pacific ground combat produced a consistent pattern in after-action and reports across every unit that encountered Japanese snipers, casualties among officers and specialists at rates that exceeded the overall casualty rate, paralysis of patrol activity in areas where snipers have been active, and a growing recognition that the standard response, return fire toward the source, was useless when the source was invisible. The problem was real. Nobody had an answer, and the men who most needed an answer were the ones being killed before they could develop one. By late 1942, the United States Marine Corps had been fighting in the Pacific for 6 months. They had won at Guadalcanal. They were winning in the islands. But the after-action reports from every engagement carry the same undercurrent, the same recurring complaint written in the careful language of military documentation. Sniper activity, officer casualties, patrol movement restricted. The Marines had one advantage over the Army in confronting this problem. They had kept alive an organizational structure, the Scout and Sniper platoon, that most Western armies had eliminated between the wars. Every Marine regiment had one on paper. The structure existed. The doctrine to fill it did not. What followed between 1942 and 1944 was one of the most deliberate institutional learning processes in American military history. It was not clean. It was not fast. It cost lives at every step. The Marine Corps, working through its training schools in California and North Carolina, began pulling apart everything it knew about sniping and rebuilding it from the conditions of the Pacific rather than the assumptions of Europe. The first conclusion was the most important. The Japanese sniper problem was not a marksmanship problem. American Marines could shoot. They had always been able to shoot. What they could not yet do was everything around the shooting. The observation, the concealment, the patience, the fieldcraft that determined whether you found the sniper before he found you. These were not minor gaps. They were the entire problem. So the schools rebuilt around fieldcraft, concealed movement through terrain, construction of hides that could withstand observation from close range, range estimation by eye without instruments, the discipline to remain in a fixed position, motionless, silent, for hours or days, observation techniques that could detect a man who did not want to be detected. Then came the structural decision that would prove most consequential. Every Marine Scout sniper would operate in a two-man team, always. One man shot, the other spotted, observed, called wind, watched for threats from other directions. The roles were interchangeable and the men trained to rotate them. Against a Japanese sniper who was always alone, who had to observe, aim, fire, and assess results all by himself, two sets of eyes working in coordinated silence was a decisive asymmetry. The system was beginning to take shape. Here is the moment the war changed for the Japanese sniper, though he would not know it for months. By mid-1943, Marine Scout sniper teams were operating with a doctrine the Japanese had not anticipated and had no prepared answer for. They were not waiting to be shot at. They were going looking. A two-man team would move forward of the line companies before an advance, sometimes 12 hours ahead, sometimes more. They would select a hide position offering observation of the ground the main force would eventually cross, and they would wait. Not for targets of opportunity, for specific things, the disturbed vegetation that indicated a prepared hide, the slight, unnatural shape in a canopy that suggested a man-made platform, the absence of birds in a section of trees that had been quiet too long. They were reading the jungle the way the Japanese sniper had always read it, and slowly, imperfectly, expensively, they were getting better at it. When a Japanese sniper position was identified, the two-man team did not engage alone. This was the second critical departure from how the problem had been approached before. The team marked the position and pulled back to bring the squad-level system to bear. The Browning automatic rifle, a weapon most armies used for fire suppression, became the primary counter-sniper tool at the squad level. Once a hide was identified or even strongly suspected, a Marine with a BAR could saturate the position with 20 rounds in seconds. A Japanese sniper who could survive single-aim shots from a bolt-action rifle could not survive a BAR working methodically through his position. When the BAR couldn't reach, when the hide was a cave in a trend too deep for the red wire in a position that small armies simply could not penetrate, the Marines brought up the flamethrower. The psychological effect would happen to snipers and giving who that I little them, that move that on the visual drive that they that right, but the specific desire that heroic concealed positions. This impact is not in the histories of the war. But it was real. A soldier trained to be invisible, trained to expect that his concealment was absolute, confronting an enemy that had developed specific methods to find and destroy concealed positions. That soldier's fundamental assumption about his own safety had been broken. In early 1944, a Marine officer named Frank Tikovsky was handed an unusual assignment and an even more unusual set of instructions for how to fill it. He was to form a scout sniper platoon for the 6th Marine Regiment. He was to train them for operations ahead of and behind the line companies. And when asked what kind of men he wanted, his answer was specific enough that it became something of a legend within the regiment. He wanted the troublemakers, not the undisciplined. The distinction mattered to him. He wanted men with initiative that exceeded their patience for institutional constraint. Men whose fitness reports described them as aggressive, difficult to manage, prone to solving problems in ways their superiors hadn't sanctioned. When two Marines got into a fight, he wanted to talk to the winner. The platoon trained in a curriculum that went well beyond marksmanship. Hand-to-hand combat was primary, not as supplementary training but as a core skill, because a man operating behind enemy lines in the Pacific might go days without being able to fire his rifle without revealing his position. If he had to kill, he needed to do it silently. Within the regiment, their reputation for acquiring supplies through methods that defied official channels earned them a name, the 40 Thieves. They sailed for Saipan in the spring of 1944, and what they did there represented something new in the Pacific War, a deliberate, organized effort to bring the sniper's own methods, patience, concealment, selective targeting, back against the Japanese sniper himself. The thieves moved ahead of the advancing line companies, sometimes by a day or more, mapping Japanese positions before those positions could be used against advancing Marines. They identified sniper hides, machine gun placements, cave networks. They carried that intelligence back, and the attacks that followed were conducted against positions the Japanese believed were secret. For the Japanese sniper, this was a new experience. He had always been the one with the information the enemy lacked. Now the enemy knew where he was before he fired. Saipan was, by any measure, one of the most demanding battles of the Pacific Campaign. More than 15,000 American casualties, 30,000 Japanese defenders under orders to fight to the last man. Terrain that missed open sugarcane fields, where a man could be seen from hundreds of yards, with jungle ravines and cave-studded ridges where visibility dropped to almost nothing. Japanese snipers operated in every one of those environments, adapting their methods to each. In the sugarcane, they used the dense stalks the way jungle snipers used undergrowth, as concealment from which to fire and into which to disappear. On the ridges, they used the cave networks that define the island's geology, firing from openings that were sometimes barely large enough to pass a rifle through. The 40 Thieves worked in all of it. The details that emerge from surviving accounts of their operations on Saipan are striking not for their drama, but for their patience. The platoon would establish a hide position days before they intended to use it. They would lie in it, motionless, silent, for hours at a time, waiting for movement that indicated a Japanese position. When they identified one, they often did not engage immediately. They watched it, mapped it, noted the times when it was occupied and when it appeared empty, and then either engaged at a moment of maximum advantage or pulled back to direct heavier weapons against it. This was the Japanese sniper's own doctrine turned against him. The patience that had made Japanese snipers so effective against Allied troops who wanted to move, advance, and clear, that same patience was now being deployed against them by men who had learned it the hard way. In one sequence of operations on a contested ridge, the thieves used their scoped rifles to systematically deny a Japanese unit the use of a route they had been relying on for resupply. Not through a dramatic engagement, through a sustained, quiet presence in a height above the route, making movement along it progressively more costly until it was abandoned. The route was lost to the Japanese not because it was attacked directly, but because a small number of patient men made it unusable. February 1945, Iwo Jima. What the Marines were about to walk into was different from anything they had faced before, and different in ways that specifically targeted the counter-sniper system they had spent 3 years building. The Japanese commander responsible for Iwo Jima's defense had studied the previous 3 years of Pacific warfare as carefully as any Allied analyst. He understood what the Marines had learned to do, and he designed his defense specifically to deny them the conditions in which the system worked best. No jungle, no canopy to scan, no trees to hide in or to sweep with automatic fire. The terrain was volcanic, broken, almost entirely without vegetation, a landscape of black sand, rocky outcroppings, and gullies that offered concealment to the defender and almost none to the attacker. And beneath it, 11 miles of reinforced concrete tunnels connecting hundreds of pillboxes, gun positions, and cave openings. A position cleared at the surface could be reoccupied from below within hours. A sniper hide that appeared empty was sometimes connected by tunnel to another position 50 yards away. The two-man team still went to work. Scout snipers moved ahead of the line companies, observing Japanese positions through patient hours of unmoving observation. But now the observation was harder. The hides were concrete, the openings were slits, the fields of fire were engineered rather than exploited from existing terrain. The BAR was still used, but against concrete it had limits. The bazooka teams, rocket-propelled weapons capable of engaging cave mouths at range, became increasingly critical, and the flamethrower became the weapon that defined Iwo Jima's ground combat more than any other. A Sherman tank fitted with a flame projector, the weapon the Marines on the line called the Zippo, could direct sustained fire into cave openings from a distance that kept it out of range of most Japanese defensive weapons. Accounts from the battle are consistent. It was one of the few weapons that reliably caused Japanese defenders to abandon fortified positions. A sniper who could endure almost anything in a well-constructed concrete hide could not endure what the Zippo delivered. The system held, at catastrophic cost, but it held. After the door in evidence. Japan had built its sniper program around the individual. Everything about the selection, the training, the doctrine, the weapon design was oriented toward producing one man who could do extraordinary things alone. The patience, the concealment, the target priority, all of it assumed a single man operating independently, relying entirely on his own skill and endurance. This was, in the right conditions, devastatingly effective against armies that had no organized counter, that did not understand the doctrine, that were still thinking in European sniper terms. It worked exactly as designed. But it had a structural weakness that the Japanese planners had not anticipated, because they had not anticipated an enemy who would study the problem systematically and build a response around it. The lone artisan, however skilled, can only look in one direction. He can only process one set of information. He experiences fatigue, hunger, and thirst in ways that degrade his performance over time. And when he fires, he reveals his position, even slightly, even briefly, to anyone who is specifically trained to look for that revelation. The Marines had built a team. 2 men working in coordinated silence, covering overlapping sectors, sharing the cognitive load of observation. Neither man had to be as individually capable as the Japanese sniper, because neither man was working alone. They had built a process. The team identified the high. The BAR suppressed it. The flamethrower destroyed it. Each element of the process covered the limitations of the others. No single weapon had to solve the whole problem. They had built a system, and systems, as the Pacific War demonstrated across 3 years of brutal evidence, outlast artisans. The Japanese sniper who had terrified Allied forces in 1942 was not less skilled in 1945. He was the same man, with the same training, the same rifle, the same doctrine. What had changed was that the Marines had learned to hunt him, methodically, patiently, using his own methods against him. The war ended in August 1945. The sniper schools at the California and North Carolina training bases had been running for 3 years. The doctrine they had developed, team-based, fieldcraft-first, combined arms counter-sniper operations, was written into the post-war manuals. And then it kept going. Korea, Vietnam. Every Marine sniper who operated in the decades that followed trained in a system whose foundations were built in the jungles of Guadalcanal and the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima. The specific techniques, the two-man team structure, the integration of sniper observation with squad-level fire support, all of it traces back to the problem the Marines were handed in 1942 and refused to leave unsolved. The Japanese sniper program, for all its sophistication, left almost nothing. A doctrine built around the individual produces knowledge that lives in individuals, and when those individuals are gone, the knowledge goes with them. Japan's specific sniper capability was extraordinary in 1942 and irrelevant by the end of the war, not because the men became less skilled but because the system built to counter them kept improving while theirs could not adapt. The men who built the Marine counter-sniper system are mostly unknown today. William Hawkins, who died clearing gun positions at Batio before the system he helped build was finished, has an airstrip named for him. Frank Tchaikovsky, who led the 40 Thieves on Saipan, is remembered because his son tracked down surviving members of the platoon decades later and recorded what they had done. Walter Walsh, who ran the sniper school, appears in a handful of memoirs. The privates and corporals, the men who learned what didn't work by being the ones it didn't work on, who paid for every tactical lesson with something that couldn't be reimbursed, are not in the histories. Most of them are not in any record that a general audience would ever find. But here is what they left. Every time the two-man sniper teams operated anywhere in the world since 1945. Every time a spotter has either thwarted in silence, covering each other's blind spots, sharing the way a man had on nail and Harry, they've been using something those men built. The ghost that Japan created was real. The system the Marines built to find him was more real. And the men who built it, in conditions that no training exercise fully prepares you for, with losses that no after-action report fully captures, deserve to be known by more than the footnotes they currently occupy. Most channels will tell you what happened in the Pacific. Very few will tell you why it happened, and fewer still will tell it from both sides of the high. If this gave you something you hadn't considered before, share it with someone who thinks they already know this war. They don't know this part.